$1.50 for a can of beans that feeds one person. Week after week, the same transaction, the same result, because nobody ever showed you there was another way. Stop reaching for the can. A $1.50 bag of dry pinto beans at any farm supply store feeds your family 8 times over, and the mountain families of Appalachian Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia knew exactly how to cook it correctly for 200 years. They called the dish soup beans, and that name matters. That is not the interesting part. The interesting part is a single step in the cooking process that almost nobody outside those mountain communities still follows. It is the step that separates a flat, grainy pot from the creamy, rich result that kept entire families alive through the hardest winters of the last century. I will get there. First, though, the full picture matters, because what happened to this knowledge was not an accident. Here is what dry beans actually cost you right now. A 15-ounce can of pinto beans runs between $1.20 and $1.50 at most national grocery chains as of 2025, and that yields roughly 1.5 cups of drained beans. A family of 4 eating beans once a week spends $60 to $80 a year on canned beans alone. The Vegetarian Resource Group conducted a direct price survey across Maryland, New Jersey, Texas, Alabama, and California in the summer of 2025, and their finding was straightforward. A half-cup serving from dry costs 14 cents. The canned equivalent costs 34 cents. 40% more, every serving, every week, sustained across every year you keep opening those cans. The cost is not only money, though. Canned pinto beans carry approximately 200 milligrams of added sodium per half-cup serving, while dry beans carry none at all. With dry beans, you control the salt, the seasoning, the fat, and the depth of flavor. Canned beans deliver a commodity. Dry beans return a craft to your kitchen, and the Appalachian families who depended on this dish were not choosing it for any romantic reason. They chose it because it worked, and they refined it across generations until it worked perfectly. Ronnie Lundy, whose book Victuals won the James Beard Award in 2016 and remains the definitive modern text on Appalachian food, called beans a specific defining food and tradition of the region. That is not a romantic framing. That is a documented cultural fact. Here is where the story gets uncomfortable. Across the mountain counties of Kentucky, Tennessee, West Virginia, Virginia, and North Carolina, dried pinto beans served as the core protein source through fall and winter. Without refrigeration, fresh meat disappeared after the first cold months, which left cured pork, dried beans, and water as what remained. The dish that came from this combination was not improvised poverty food. Bill Best, a farmer and documented seed saver from Berea, Kentucky, recorded that mountain families simply bought pinto beans rather than growing them, because the beans arrived too cheaply to justify the labor of cultivating your own. But the way those families cooked them carried 2 centuries of refinement. 1 pound of dry pintos, a ham hock, or 2 strips of thick bacon, an onion, water, and thyme. Traditionally, the rendering fat was fatback rather than bacon, a distinction that shows up consistently in the older sources, though bacon produces a comparable result. The soup beans went into a cast-iron Dutch oven, and they came out served alongside a skillet of cornbread, with chow chow, the pickled relish of cabbage and peppers, spooned directly on top. That combination, soup beans, cornbread, and chow chow, is the complete meal. It is the form that survived. In 1904, industrial can production reached full mechanization, and by 1910, 35,000 cans per day moved off production lines with minimal labor. Companies including H.J. Heinz and Campbell's Soups entered the dried legume market across the following decades and established the canned bean as the canned standard. The cultural shift accelerated after the Second World War, when convenience became the dominant value of the American kitchen. A poverty stigma attached itself to dry beans through the mid-20th century, and the dish that had carried mountain families through the Great Depression quietly became something people were encouraged to move past. No single regulatory body issued a directive against dry bean cooking. The displacement came through economics and culture rather than legislation, but the result arrived at the same destination. By 1970, most Americans under 30 had never cooked a pot of beans from dry. The knowledge did not vanish through a single suppression event. It eroded under a price point and a marketing environment, while the communities holding onto it were dismissed as behind the times. Now, if you are thinking this only applies to someone with a full farmhouse kitchen and hours to spare, stay with me, because this next part is specifically for you. 1 pound of dry pinto beans costs between $1.50 and $1.75 at any farm supply or grocery store as of 2025. Add a ham hock or 2 strips of thick bacon, or fatback if your butcher carries it, at $1.50 to $2.50, and salt, pepper, and half an onion, and the full pot lands under $5. That pot feeds 6 to 8 people. A heavy-bottomed pot or cast-iron Dutch oven is all the equipment required, and most kitchens already carry one. Active preparation runs 15 minutes. The overnight soak is passive. The simmer takes 2 to 3 hours on low heat, which means you start it Saturday morning and eat it at lunch, with cornbread. Sunday's portion will be better than Saturday's. That last point is not a recipe suggestion. It describes the mechanism. Each time the beans reheat, starches released from the bean cell walls continue to gelatinize, and the potlikker, which is the cooking liquid, thickens further. Pork fat rendered slowly through the initial simmer emulsifies with that starch-rich broth, producing a creamy consistency no canned product has replicated. The beans do not degrade on reheating. They improve. This is a dish that compounds across days. But the technique I promised you is not the reheat. Read that sentence again and ask yourself what mountain cooks preserved that modern recipe writers quietly removed. The document is called Cooking and Using Dried Beans and Peas, published by Michigan State University Extension Service in December 1991, authored by Penny Ross, Extension Food and Nutrition Specialist, cataloged as Extension Bulletin E1705. 2 pages. I found it in the MSU Library Archive, and what it preserves, alongside what virtually every modern recipe omits entirely, is the salt timing instruction. Salt goes in last, not at the start, not scattered throughout. In the final 30 minutes of cooking, after the beans have already begun to soften. The chemistry is direct. Salt introduced at the beginning of cooking toughens the cell wall, which causes the skins to resist softening and prevents the starch from releasing cleanly into the broth. The result is firm, mealy beans sitting in thin liquid, the exact result that convinces people dry beans are not worth the effort. Mountain cooks never made this mistake. Salt arrived when the beans were already giving way, and only then. That single omission explains most failed attempts at this dish. Mark Sohn, the author of Appalachian Home Cooking and one of the documented authorities on mountain food history, covers this preparation tradition in exactly the terms that match what mountain families actually practiced. Now, here is the honesty. The canned bean carries a legitimate advantage in time. 3 to 24 hours of soaking and cooking represents a real investment, and if you are feeding one person on a work night with no preparation window, the can is faster. That is a fair point. What it does not address is planning. A pot of soup beans started the night before or on a weekend morning costs 15 minutes of active effort and produces 8 servings. The canned equivalent of those 8 servings costs between $8 and $12 and carries added sodium through every one of them. The difference is cost. The difference is texture and nutritional control. The difference is that compounding result across multiple days that no sealed can, at any price, has ever been able to deliver. Beans were domesticated in Mesoamerica approximately 7,000 to 8,000 years ago. The Cherokee cultivated them in the southern mountains as one of the 3 sisters alongside corn and squash, long before European settlers arrived through the Cumberland Gap in the 1750s. The Blue Ridge and the broader Appalachian Range became the geography that held this knowledge in place for the following 2 centuries. Scotch-Irish, German, and Swedish settlers adopted the practice, and Appalachian families carried documented versions of it across 5 generations in communities including Indian Creek, Kentucky. Across Latin America, the same cooking liquid appears as potage, used as a nutritious broth and cooking base. Independent food cultures on multiple continents arrived at the same solution across centuries because the solution worked. If you are the kind of person who believes that real knowledge has been quietly buried to protect someone else's market, you already know where the subscribe button is. Next video, I am going to show you one more piece of Appalachian food preservation. There is a specific technique for drying beans in their pods, called leather britches, that I have only found described accurately in one documented mountain agricultural source. The bean variety that works best for this is the greasy bean, an heirloom cultivar with smooth, shiny pods that mountain families have grown along the Blue Ridge and through the Cumberland Plateau for generations. Most modern guides leave out the single detail that determines whether the preserved beans remain edible through winter or spoil by the 2nd month. Subscribe so you do not miss it. Tell me in the comments where you are from and whether anyone in your family still cooks beans from dry. Tell me what they called the cooking liquid. Tell me whether they served chow chow alongside it. I read every comment, and this audience carries knowledge the internet has not indexed yet. Put it down below.